I have plotted a great many roads in my life, but only one of them I am asked about, and I am old enough now that I no longer pretend the asking does not please me. People hear that I was on the waymark when we crossed the Albany corridor, and they lean forward the way the young always do, wanting the part where the guns spoke. There were no guns. That is the first thing I tell them, and the part they never believe until I have talked a long while. We crossed the road no one had ever crossed without leave, and not a single shot was fired by anyone, and the reason for that is the whole of the story. I was master astrogator of the convoy. That is a plain title for plain work. I read the dark and I told the ships where the dark was kind and where it was not. By the time we reached the corridor, I had been doing it for 11 years aboard the Waymark, and longer than that on lesser ships before her, and I had a navigator's hands, which is to say hands that had forgotten how to be still. We were not an exploration fleet. We were not a war fleet, whatever the histories want to make of us. We were a migration. There is no grander word for what we were, and no smaller one either. Behind the Waymark and her 3 sister escorts came the transports, and the transports were the point of everything. 40,000 sleepers in the Olive Brand, 31,000 in the Tennyson. The Coronac carried the seed vaults and the soil, and the patient frozen herds that would one day be cattle on a world none of us would see green. The Harrow carried the people who could not sleep, the keepers, the watch crews, the children too young to be put under, the old who had asked to stay awake for the whole of it because they would not survive the waking otherwise and wished to spend what they had on looking. We carried our home with us. That is the thing I want understood before anything else. We were not running to a home. We were not fleeing one. The home was in the holds, banked and frozen and alive, and we were taking it across the dark to put it down somewhere it could grow. A migration is not an escape, and it is not a conquest. It is a people carrying everything they are toward a place to set it down. The corridor was the trouble. I had known it would be the trouble for 2 years before we reached it, because the charts knew it, and the charts were honest with me even when no one else was. You must understand what a drift corridor is, or the rest makes no sense. Between the stars there are currents, not winds, nothing so simple, but channels in the deep structure of space where the cost of crossing is 1/10 of what it is elsewhere, where a ship can ride the grain of the dark instead of cutting against it. They are old beyond reckoning. They were old when the first thing with a thought looked up. And of all the powers that have ever moved through the galaxy, only one had made the corridors their whole reason for being, and that was the Albany. We did not know them by that name when we set out. We knew them by their work. Every chart I had inherited, every record traded hand to hand across 1,000 years of human distance-keeping, carried the same warning in some form. The great roads are held. Do not enter the drift unasked. Travelers who had gone before us, alien and human alike, came back with the same account or did not come back at all, and the ones who came back said the same thing in different mouths. You stop. You lower your drives until your ship is cold and blind and slow, and you ask the road, and if you are granted it, you do not cross the corridor. You join it. That was the part that took me longest to understand, and the part that mattered most. The Albany were a migratory people, not a migratory people the way we were, with a beginning behind us and an end we hoped for ahead. They had no end and they wanted none. They were the drift itself, made into flesh and given a will. Their ships were not built. They were grown and they were alive, vast pale arcs the size of moons that had been moving along the corridors since before any history I could name, calving smaller arcs, taking in what crossed their path, folding it into the long, slow procession of themselves. They did not conquer. I want to be fair to them because they were not cruel and the histories that make them cruel have not understood them. They did not burn worlds or break fleets. They simply moved eternally, and everything that wished to use their roads was made to move with them. You asked the road, and the road took you, and you became one more current in the great drift of the Albany, your ships running cold in the wake of their living arcs, your purpose folded gently and forever into theirs. In 10,000 years of it, no one had ever crossed their corridor and come out the far side still themselves. To the Albany, this was not a policy. It was not even a law the way we mean law. It was the shape of the universe. Things that move through the drift join the drift. Water runs downhill. The dead do not speak. Things that move through the corridor ask the road. These were not rules to them. They were facts. And we were going to cross the corridor. Not join it. Cross it, transverse, in and out the other side, because the corridor lay between us and the only road that reached the world we were carrying our home toward, and going around it would have cost us 40 years, and we did not have 40 years of consumables for 100,000 souls. The charts were honest with me. There was the corridor, and there was no way but through it, and through it had never been done. I plotted that crossing more times than I plotted anything else in my life. I knew the grain of that drift better than I knew my own hands by the end. I knew where the current was kindest, and where the Albany arcs were thickest, and where, if it came to it, a fast convoy holding tight formation might thread the gap before the great slow-living things could close. I did not love that plot. A navigator wants margin, and that plot had no margin in it anywhere. But it was the road, and it was my work to read the road, and I read it true. We came into the mouth of the corridor in the long ship night, all of us running quiet, the transports clustered close behind the 4 escorts like a hand closed around something it would not drop. I remember the bridge of the Waymark that watch as clearly as I remember anything. Captain Idris, a decanal in the command chair, who had been a destroyer man for 30 years, and had taken this shepherd's post, because he said a man should end his service guarding something worth guarding. The watch standing quiet at their boards, and the corridor opening ahead of us on my plot like a great pale river of easier dark, beautiful and forbidden, and somewhere down it, the slow stirring I had been dreading for 2 years. They knew we were there almost at once. Of course they did. It was their road. They felt our keels in it the way you feel a footstep on a floor you are lying on. I watched them rise on my instruments before any eye could have seen them. A shifting in the grain of the drift far down the corridor, a wrongness in the current, and then the returns hardening into shapes, and the shapes were impossible, and then they were not impossible. They were simply very, very large. "Master Astrogator," the captain said, "tell me what I'm looking at." "A drift herd, sir," I said. My voice was steadier than I was. "Coming up the corridor toward us. Lead element." I checked the figure twice because I did not believe it. Lead element masses on the order of a small moon. There are 9 of them I can resolve. There will be more behind that I can't. 9 living arcs the size of moons, rising up the road to meet 4 escort cruisers and a clutch of transports. I have stood in a great many tight places, and I will tell you honestly that my hands wanted to shake and I would not let them, because the plot was on my board and the plot needed reading. And a navigator who lets her hands shake gives a bad plot, and a bad plot kills everyone. So I read the road. That is the only courage I had to offer, and I offered it. They did not come fast. That was the strangest thing, and the thing I think frightened the younger watchstanders most. There was no charge, no scramble, no sense of an enemy closing. The Albany did not do anything quickly because they had never in 10,000 years needed to. They came up the corridor at the unhurried pace of something that has all of time, and they spread as they came, the way a hand opens, the 9 great pale shapes fanning across the width of the drift to make a wall of themselves, and I understood without being told that they were not arraying to attack us. They were arraying to receive us. They were opening to take us in. They had felt travelers in their road, and they were doing what they had always done, which was to slow and spread, and wait for the travelers to stop and lower their drives and ask the road. Then they spoke. Not in words, I do not want to give the impression of words. It came up the corridor as a pressure, a vast low patient call that we felt in the hull and in the deck and somewhere under the breastbone, a sound that was not quite sound, modulated and structured and unmistakably a thing said by a mind. The xenolinguists aboard the Harrow took it apart over the days that followed and gave us a great many careful translations, but they all came down to the same plain thing in the end, and it was not a threat. It was the kindest thing in the galaxy, by the lights of the people who said it. It was an invitation. "Slow," the herd call said. "Slow and be still and ask the road, and you will be taken up, and you will never be alone in the dark again. Slow, join, come into the drift." I have thought about that call for a great many years. I have thought that there is no malice in the whole of it, and that this is exactly what made it terrible. They were not threatening to destroy us. They were offering to keep us. They had kept everything else. Across 10,000 years, every people that came to that road, frightened and small and tired of the dark, had heard that great patient call and had wept with relief, and had lowered their drives and asked the road, and had been folded into the endless gentle procession of the Albany, and had never been themselves again, and had, by every account, been grateful. Why would they not be? The dark is very large and very cold, and a people alone in it is a small and frightened thing, and here was a vastness that would carry you and never let you fall. Slow, join. You will never be alone again. We did not slow. I want to be precise about this, because it is the whole hinge of the thing and the histories blur it. There was no defiance on our bridge. No one shouted. No one made a speech. Captain Adekunle did not rise from his chair and declare anything to the dark. He listened to the call as the linguists fed him the first rough sense of it, and his face did not change, and he looked at my plot, and he looked at the great pale wall spreading across the road ahead, and he said, in the flat working voice of a man giving a routine order, "Hold course, hold formation, steady on the master astrogator's plot." And we held course. The 4 escorts and the transports clustered behind them, 100,000 human souls and the frozen seed of a world, going on up the corridor at the steady pace of people with somewhere to be, into the opening arms of a thing the size of 9 moons that had never once been refused. I do not think the Albany understood at first what was happening. I have come to believe they could not have understood it, because nothing in 10,000 years had prepared them for it. They had felt travelers stop 1,000 times. They had never felt travelers not stop. When we held our course, the great call came again, louder, and it was not angrier. I want to be clear that it never once became angry, but it became more urgent, more insistent. The way you raise your voice to someone you think simply has not heard you. "Slow," it said. "You have not slowed. Be still. Ask the road." And we held course. And the wall ahead of us was no longer a wall we were approaching, but a wall we were going to reach. And the gap I had plotted between the 3rd and 4th arcs, the thread of kinder current I had read 2 years before this moment, lay open on my board exactly where I had said it would lie, and the captain said, "Master astrogator, take us through your gap." "Aye, sir," I said, and I gave the helm the road. Then the herd moved to close us in. It was not fast even then, but a thing the size of a moon does not need to be fast. The 2 nearest arcs began to drift together, narrowing my gap, the gap I had counted on, and I watched it narrow on my board, and I felt the bottom go out of 2 years of planning, because they were going to shut the road before we reached it, not with malice, not even with effort, just by being what they were, vast and slow and certain we would stop, certain we would do what everything always did. And from the lead arc came something new, not the great gentle call now, but a finer thing, a focused pulse that swept across the convoy and lingered on the olive brand, on the Tennyson, on the transports, and the linguists' faces went strange when they parsed it, and one of them said into the bridge circuit, very quietly, "Sir, I think that was a count. I think they just counted the souls aboard the transports. I think they're sorting us, deciding what to take up first." I will not pretend I was calm when I heard that. The olive brand had 40,000 sleepers in her, and a thing the size of a moon had just looked at them the way a herdsman looks across a flock, deciding which to bring in first. And the gap I had spent 2 years reading was closing, and we were not going to make it. And 100,000 people who had given their whole lives and their children's lives to the dream of a world were about to be folded gently and forever into the wake of something that would carry them kindly into oblivion. And then the Waymark and her sisters lit up. I have heard that moment described 100 ways by people who were not there. They make it a battle cry. They make it a thunderclap. It was neither. What it was this. The 4 escort cruisers which had been running quiet and cold and small in the great current, which the Albany had not troubled to count because the Albany did not think in terms of escorts, woke all at once. Not to fire. There was no fire. They woke the way a thing wakes that has been holding itself still on purpose. The Waymark's reactors came off their banked idle, and the whole long industrial body of her, every weathered armored panel of her, every gun emplacement and missile cell and sensor mast, ran live in an instant, and her drives, which had been whispering, opened into a hard, bright blue roar that I felt come up through the deck into my spine. And the same happened on the Steadfast and the Drover and the Longhold, all 4 at once, in the same heartbeat, because they had drilled this until it was one motion, and the 4 of them flared into full life and closed up tight around the transports and put themselves between the flock and the great pale arcs, and held. And they did not fire. That is the part no one believes, and it is the part that is the whole of it. They did not fire. They lit and they roared and they closed ranks, and they aimed. Every gun on every cruiser came round and bore on the nearest arcs, and the targeting returns lit my board like a city, and the firing solutions were good, and the crews stood at their stations with their hands on the work, and then they simply held there, 4 armed and roaring and unbowed warships between 100,000 sleeping souls and a thing the size of 9 moons, and they did not fire, and they did not slow, and they did not ask. And the message of that was louder than any gun could ever have been. "We will not stop," the Waymark said in the only language that needed no linguist. "We will not be still. We will not ask the road. This is our convoy and that is our home in those holds, and we are taking it across your corridor and you will not put your hand on it. And if you put your hand on it, we are entirely able to make you regret the reaching, but we do not want to, and we are not here for that. We are only here to pass. We are passing. Stand or do not stand. We are coming through." The herd call stopped. I have never in my life heard a silence like the one that came down that corridor then. The great patient pressure that had been on us since the arcs rose, that low certain invitation that had not faltered even when we held our course, simply ceased, all at once, as if a vast voice that had been speaking for 10,000 years had been struck dumb. And in the silence, the 2 nearest arcs, which had been drifting together to close my gap, stopped drifting. They hung there in the current, enormous and pale and utterly still, and I watched them on my board and I could not breathe, because I did not know what a thing the size of a moon does when it has been refused for the first time in the whole of its existence, and neither did anyone alive. What it did in the end was look at us. I cannot put it better than that, and I have tried for years. The focused pulse came again, the fine sweeping thing, but it was not a count this time. It was slower, and it moved across the Waymark and lingered, and moved to the Steadfast and lingered, and the Drover and the Longhold, the 4 roaring armed unmoving cruisers standing their wall in front of the flock. And I understood, we all understood, by then, in the way you understand a thing you have no words for, that they were seeing us. Truly seeing us for the first time, because for the first time we had done a thing that made us visible to them. We had refused the road. We had stood armed and ready and entirely capable in the open mouth of the drift, and we had declined to join, and we had declined to flee, and we had declined to fight, and we had simply held our home close and made plain that we were going on, and there was no shape in the whole of their long memory for a people who did that. And so they looked at us as if they had never seen anything at all. They did not understand us through any of the things the histories like. There was no missing file, no failed category, no clever human trick that broke their machines. I have read the accounts that make it so, and they have it wrong. The Albany were not confounded by a puzzle. They were not outwitted. They were a people who had spent 10,000 years certain of one fact about the universe, that things which move through the drift join the drift, and they had just watched that fact be untrue calmly, with armed and steady hands, by a small bright convoy that carried its own home and asked no one's leave. It was not a riddle that stopped them. It was a revelation. They had believed that everything alone in the dark wanted, above all things not to be alone, and would give anything, would give itself, for the great gentle certainty of the drift. And here was a people who were alone in the dark and were not frightened of it, who carried their own warmth in their own holds, who had made themselves a home small enough to take with them and strong enough to defend, and who would rather cross the whole cold width of the galaxy on their own road than be carried, however kindly, on anyone else's. That was the thing they had never met, not a weapon, a freedom, a people who would rather be themselves in the dark than be safe in someone else's wake. And there is no answer to that because it is not an argument and it is not an attack. It is only a way of being, held steady at gunpoint, that the whole architecture of the Albany had no place for. We held the wall for 9 hours. I will not pretend they were easy hours. The transports ran their drives hot, and the escorts held their firing solutions, and the crews stood their stations until they swayed, and I stood at my board and read the road, because the road still had to be read, because at any moment the arcs might decide that 10,000 years of certainty was worth more than 4 cruisers and might close my gap after all. And if they moved, I would have a half a second to give the helm a way through. And so I read the road for 9 hours and did not let my hands shake. And the arcs hung there, vast and pale and silent, and looked at us, and did not close, and did not call, and did not move. And then in the 10th hour, they opened the road. It was the second arcs that moved first, the 2 that had been drifting together to shut my gap. They drew apart again, slowly, slowly, the way they did everything, and the gap I had plotted 2 years before opened back to its full kind width and then wider, much wider, far wider than my plot had ever dared hope, until it was not a gap at all but a clear lane down the center of the corridor with the great pale arcs drawn back to either side, and I understood, and I could not speak. And beside me, the captain understood too, and his hands closed hard on the arms of his chair. They were giving us the road. Not granting it. I have been careful with that word all my life, and I am careful with it now. To grant the road in the Albany way was to take you up, to fold you into the drift. The granting was the taking. This was not that. This was something they had never done in 10,000 years because they had never had cause to imagine it. They drew back their arcs and they opened a clear lane down the heart of their own corridor, and they made of themselves not a wall and not a net, but an honor guard, 2 great pale ranks to either side of a free road, and they held it open, and they let us through. And then they came with us. I did not expect that, and neither did anyone. As the Waymark led the convoy into the open lane, drives still hot, guns still bearing but no longer aimed at anything, the 2 nearest arcs fell in alongside us, not closing, not crowding, but packing us, 1 to either flank, matching our speed down the corridor at a respectful distance, the way an escort rides with a thing it has chosen to see safely through. The herd call came again then, but it was changed, and the linguists were a long time giving us its sense, and when they did, the senior of them was weeping, which I had never seen a linguist do, and I have always trusted her translation more for the tears in it. The call did not say slow. It did not say join. It did not say ask the road. It said, as near as human words can carry it, we did not know you could be made. We did not know a thing could be alone in the dark and not be afraid. Go. Go on your own road. We will see you to the far side because we wish to, and for no other reason, and when your road and ours divide we will let you go, because you were never ours to keep. They rode with us for the rest of the corridor. 2 living arcs the size of moons, pale and patient and utterly silent now, packing a clutch of human transports and 4 weary cruisers down the heart of a road no one had ever crossed, and seeing us through. The crews stood down from their stations in shifts and slept and stood to again, and the arcs were always there, 1 to either flank, and somewhere in the second day of it the strangeness of it wore off and was replaced by something I have never had a good word for, something between awe and a kind of terrible tenderness, because we understood by then what we had done, and we understood what it had cost them. And we understood that they were riding with us not as captors and not as guards, but as a people who had had one certainty for 10,000 years, and had given it up in an afternoon, for us, and were spending these last days of the corridor simply being near the thing that had changed them. The way you linger near a fire on a night you know you will remember all your life. When the corridor ended, the roads divided. Ours bent away toward the long dark reach that led to the world we were carrying our home to plant. Theirs ran on down the eternal drift, the way it always had and the way it always would. And at the dividing the two arcs slowed and drew back, and the convoy went on, and I watched on my board as the great pale shapes fell behind and grew small and were gone, back into the drift, back into the endless gentle procession of themselves, carrying with them the one thing they had ever taken from us that we were glad to give, which was the knowledge that a people could be free in the dark and unafraid. We crossed, 100,000 souls in the frozen seat of a world, across the road no one had ever crossed without being unmade by the crossing, and not one shot fired by anyone, and not one of us folded into anyone else's wake. We put our home down on the world we had carried it to, in the end, and it grew, and I lived to see it green, which is more than most navigators dare to hope for. And the young come to me still and lean forward wanting the part where the guns spoke, and I tell them, every time, that the guns never spoke, that the whole of it was 4 tired warships who lit and roared and aimed and held and would not fire, standing a wall in front of their sleeping people, and refusing with armed and steady hands to be carried. That is what they saw, the Albany, when they truly looked at us for the first time. Not our weapons, though we had them and meant them. Not our cleverness, though we are clever enough. They saw a people who had built a home small enough to take with them and strong enough to keep, and who would cross the whole cold width of the galaxy on their own road, armed and unbowed and unafraid, rather than be carried in comfort on anyone else's. They had kept everything that ever crossed their corridor in 10,000 years, because everything that ever crossed it had, in the end, been more afraid of the dark than it loved being itself. We were not. That was the whole of the reveal, and it was enough, and it opened a road that had never been opened. I have plotted a great many roads in my life. That is the only one I am asked about, and I no longer pretend the asking does not please me, because the answer pleases me more. We held our home close, and we held our course, and we crossed.